I haven't touched a black woman in 10 years, the giant cowboy confessed to the lonely black widow who would change his life forever. The gavel struck 3 times against weathered wood. Eudora Temples clutched her husband's land deed with trembling fingers as 12 white faces stared down at her from the dusty, hollow town council bench. Sheriff Eli Tremble leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the table. His badge caught the afternoon light streaming through dirty windows. He squinted at the papers in Dory's hands like they were written in a foreign language. The deed bore Samuel's careful signature, black ink on yellowed paper. 40 acres of prairie land with a small cabin and herb garden, everything she had left of their life together. Council members whispered among themselves. One pointed at irregular stamps on the document. Another shook his head at faded watermarks. Sheriff Tremble cleared his throat and stood. He questioned whether someone of her background could properly read legal documents. His voice carried across the packed room. Townspeople shifted in their wooden chairs. A few snickered behind gloved hands. Dory's spine straightened. She had read every surveying book Samuel owned. She understood property law better than most men in that room. But her voice caught in her throat as 12 pairs of eyes dismissed her without hearing a single word. The council voted unanimously. Her claim needed further investigation. Sheriff Tremble would handle the matter personally. 2 deputies escorted her to the door. Her boots echoed against creaking floorboards as she walked the length of the room. Every step felt like judgment. Every whisper felt like a nail in her coffin. Outside, dust swirled around her long skirts. The main street of Dusty Hollow stretched before her like a gauntlet. Store owners watched from their doorways. Children peeked around their mothers' aprons. Dory climbed into her weathered wagon. The old mare snorted and pawed at the dirt. Even her horse seemed eager to leave this place behind. The ride home took her past other small farms, other families who looked like her, other widows who had lost their men to accidents or sickness. She wondered how many of them had faced similar questions about their paperwork. Her cabin sat at the edge of a rolling meadow. Samuel had built it with his own hands before the fever took him. Every board told a story. Every nail held a memory. Inside, she found his hidden journal tucked behind loose floorboards. His careful handwriting filled page after page, references to underground springs, notes about railroad investors, questions about Sheriff Tremble's sudden wealth. The final entry made her blood run cold. Samuel had discovered something about the real owners of Dusty Hollow, something that could change everything. Dory pressed the journal to her chest. Her home might be in danger, but Samuel had left her the tools to fight back. 3 days after the humiliation at the town council, Dory knelt beside her poisoned well. The water had turned an ugly brown color overnight. Dead fish floated on the surface like accusations. She dipped her finger into the murky liquid and tasted it. Bitter, metallic. Someone had dumped something deliberate down her water source. The nearest clean water sat 2 miles away at the town pump. Dory hitched her mare to the wagon and loaded empty buckets into the back. Her herb garden was already wilting in the morning heat. Main Street buzzed with its usual activity. Merchants hawked their wares from wooden storefronts. Children chased chickens between wagon wheels. The blacksmith's hammer rang against hot iron. Dory pulled her wagon up to the town well. A mountain of a man stood nearby, watering his massive black stallion. He had to be 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that could block out the sun. Jackson Bigsby. She had heard the whispers about him at the general store. Former lawman turned drifter, hands the size of dinner plates, a voice that could shake windows when he chose to use it. He glanced at her approach and immediately looked away. His jaw tightened like he had swallowed something sour. Most men in town either stared too long or ignored her completely. This one seemed afraid to even acknowledge her existence. Dory lowered her first bucket into the well. The rope burned against her palms as she hauled up the water, 40 pounds of liquid in each container. She would need at least 6 buckets to keep her garden alive another day. Jackson finished with his horse and turned to leave. His boots were the size of small boats. His hat could have sheltered a family of 4. The second bucket came up heavier than expected. Dory's grip slipped on the wet rope. Water sloshed everywhere as the container crashed back down the well shaft. Jackson stopped walking. He stood frozen for a long moment with his back to her. His massive hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Finally, he turned around. His face looked like it was carved from granite. Deep lines around his eyes spoke of too many years under the desert sun. He walked back to the well without saying a word. His hands covered the rope completely as he hauled up bucket after bucket. Each container looked like a child's toy in his grip. Dory loaded the water into her wagon bed. The giant cowboy worked in silence beside her. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. When the last bucket was secure, Jackson stepped back. He removed his hat and ran thick fingers through salt and pepper hair. The words came out like they had been trapped inside him for years. He confessed that he had not touched a black woman in 10 years. Not a handshake, not a helping hand, not even accidentally bumping into someone on a crowded street. Dory set down her water ladle. This was not what she had expected from the intimidating stranger. Jackson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He told her about Amarillo County, about a family of homesteaders with legal claim to 60 acres of prime farmland, about corrupt officials who arrived with fake paperwork and armed men. He had been a U.S. Marshal then, young and idealistic with a badge that meant something. The homesteader's wife had grabbed his arm and begged him to intervene. She was no older than Dory, no taller than his shoulder, but Jackson had frozen. The corrupt officials outnumbered him 3-1. They had rifles and the backing of local law enforcement. His captain had warned him about getting involved in land disputes without proper federal authorization. So he did nothing. He watched them drag the woman away from her husband and children. Watched them burn the cabin that family had built with their own hands. Watched them load a wagon with everything those people owned and drive away into the desert. The woman's eyes haunted him still. The way she had looked at his badge like it meant protection, like it meant justice, like it meant hope. Jackson had quit the Marshal service the next week. He could not wear that badge knowing what it really represented. Could not shake another hand knowing how easily his own hands failed when courage mattered most. For 10 years he had drifted from town to town. He helped when he could but kept his distance from situations that reminded him of his greatest failure. Especially from black women who might look at him the way that homesteader's wife had looked at his badge. Dory listened to every word. She recognized the weight of guilt in his voice. The way shame could eat at a person from the inside until it poisoned everything they touched. She asked him which county the incident had occurred in. Jackson told her Amarillo County, about 50 miles northeast of Dusty Hollow. Dory's breath caught in her throat. Samuel had worked as a surveyor in Amarillo County before they met. His journal contained references to corrupt land deals in that exact area. She told Jackson about her husband's hidden notes, about underground springs and railroad investors, about Sheriff Tremble's suspicious wealth and her own poisoned well. Jackson's eyes sharpened like a hunter catching scent of his prey. His years as a federal marshal had taught him to recognize criminal patterns. Everything Dory described matched the methods used by a disbanded outlaw gang he had pursued years ago. The same gang that had operated in Amarillo County 10 years earlier. Jackson followed Dory's wagon back to her cabin. His stallion dwarfed her old mare as they rode side by side across the prairie. The afternoon sun beat down on their shoulders like a hammer against an anvil. Samuel's surveying equipment filled one corner of the small cabin. Brass instruments gleamed in wooden cases. Maps covered every inch of the kitchen table. Measurement tools hung from pegs like surgical instruments. Dory spread her husband's journal across the surface. Samuel's handwriting looked like tiny ant tracks marching across yellowed pages. Numbers filled the margins. Calculations ran down the sides of each entry. Jackson squinted at the mathematical formulas. His martial training had included basic surveying knowledge, but nothing this complex. Samuel Temples had been a master craftsman with numbers. Dory traced her finger along a series of measurements. Samuel had taught her to read survey marks during their 5 years of marriage. Every evening after dinner, he would spread his work across their table and explain the day's discoveries. Property lines told stories if you knew how to read them. Samuel had shown her how to spot inconsistencies in official documents, how to calculate acreage from boundary markers, how to detect when surveys had been deliberately falsified. The journal contained dozens of red-flagged entries, properties that had been remeasured multiple times, boundaries that shifted between official filings, acreage that somehow grew or shrank depending on who filed the paperwork. Jackson recognized the pattern immediately. The same methods had been used by the Crimson Creek Gang during their 3-year reign of terror across 4 counties. They would identify valuable land, forge new surveys, bribe local officials, and then seize properties through fraudulent legal proceedings. Federal marshals had finally disbanded the gang 2 years ago. Most members had been killed or imprisoned, but the ringleader had escaped justice and vanished into the desert. Dory pulled out a hand-drawn map from the back of Samuel's journal. Underground water sources ran beneath Dusty Hollow like veins of liquid gold. Springs fed into underground rivers, rivers connected to natural reservoirs. Samuel's notes indicated the water system could support a major settlement. Railroad companies would pay fortunes for reliable water sources along their planned routes. Desert towns with guaranteed water supplies became boom cities overnight. Jackson studied the financial calculations in the journal margins. Someone had been systematically acquiring water-rich properties for pennies on the dollar. The total acreage now exceeded 3,000 acres of prime railroad development land. Sheriff Eli Tremble's name appeared throughout Samuel's recent entries. Questions about his sudden wealth, notes about his new house and expensive horses, observations about his connections to out-of-town investors. The final journal entry was dated 3 days before Samuel's supposed accident. He had written about confronting Tremble with evidence of the land fraud, about demanding the return of stolen properties, about threatening to contact federal authorities. Dory's hands trembled as she read her husband's last words. Samuel had known the danger but felt compelled to act. He could not watch his neighbors lose their homes to criminal conspiracy. A knock at the cabin door interrupted their investigation. Dory peered through the window and saw a young woman with ink-stained fingers and a determined expression. Hattie Gale carried a leather satchel stuffed with papers. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable. Her boots were built for walking rather than dancing. She had been investigating the same land transfer patterns that filled Samuel's journal. Her newspaper editor had dismissed her concerns as female hysteria. But Hattie possessed a sharp mind for details and an instinct for corruption. Her satchel contained copies of every property deed filed in Dusty Hollow over the past 2 years. She had spent weeks at the county courthouse, copying documents by hand. Her investigation revealed a web of fraudulent transactions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Jackson compared Hattie's documentation to Samuel's survey notes. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic theft. Properties were being stolen through forged documents, false surveys, and corrupt legal proceedings. The 3 of them worked until sunset, organizing evidence into chronological order. Each fraudulent land grab followed the same pattern. Each victim shared similar characteristics. Each case had been approved by Sheriff Tremble's office. Dory's mathematical skills proved invaluable. She could calculate the exact acreage discrepancies between original surveys and fraudulent filings. Her precision with numbers provided irrefutable proof of deliberate falsification. Jackson contributed his knowledge of criminal networks and legal procedures. His martial experience helped identify which evidence would hold up in federal court. His understanding of gang operations revealed the scope of the conspiracy. Hattie brought organizational skills and documentation. Her photography equipment could provide visual proof of their discoveries. Her newspaper connections offered a platform for exposing the truth. As darkness fell across the prairie, the three unlikely allies had assembled a comprehensive case against Sheriff Tremble and his criminal network. But they also realized the magnitude of what they faced. Tremble controlled local law enforcement. He had connections to powerful investors. He commanded resources that dwarfed their small group of reformers. Jackson stared out the cabin window at the star-filled sky. For 10 years, he had avoided confrontations that reminded him of his greatest failure. Now he faced a situation that demanded everything he had been too cowardly to give before. Dory organized Samuel's surveying tools with reverent care. Her husband had died trying to protect their community. She would not let his sacrifice be meaningless. Hattie packed her evidence with the determination of someone who had found her life's purpose. The truth demanded to be told regardless of the consequences. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance. The sound carried across empty miles like a warning of dangers yet to come. Samuel's final survey notes contained measurements that made no sense. Property boundaries that curved where they should be straight. Water access points marked in impossible locations. Elevation changes that defied the local geography. Dory spread the mysterious calculations across her kitchen table. Jackson leaned over her shoulder, while Hattie held a lantern to illuminate the cramped handwriting. The numbers looked like a foreign language written in Samuel's familiar script. Then Dory understood. Her husband had been writing in code. Samuel had disguised his most dangerous discoveries as routine surveying errors. Each seemingly incorrect measurement actually recorded evidence of criminal activity. Each impossible boundary marker revealed another piece of the land fraud conspiracy. Jackson watched in amazement as Dory decoded her husband's secret language. Her mathematical training allowed her to reverse Samuel's clever encryption. What appeared to be professional mistakes were actually precise documentation of systematic theft. The decoded measurements revealed the true scope of Sheriff Tremble's operation. Over 40 properties had been stolen through fraudulent surveys. Families had lost their homes based on deliberately falsified boundary markers. The total stolen acreage exceeded 5,000 acres. But Samuel's most shocking discovery lay hidden in his final calculations. The underground spring system beneath Dusty Hollow was 3 times larger than anyone suspected. Railroad investors would pay millions for guaranteed water access across such a vast area. Hattie copied the decoded information into her reporter's notebook. Her handwriting flew across the pages as she documented each revelation. This story would expose corruption on a scale that reached far beyond their small town. Jackson studied Samuel's notes about confronting Sheriff Tremble. The surveyor had scheduled a meeting for the day after his supposed accident. He planned to demand the return of all stolen properties or face federal prosecution. Samuel never made it to that meeting. His wagon had been found overturned in a ravine with him trapped beneath. The official cause of death was listed as accidental crushing injuries. No investigation had been conducted. Dory's hands shook as she read the truth about her husband's murder. Samuel had been eliminated because he threatened to expose the entire criminal conspiracy. His death had been carefully staged to look accidental. The cabin door rattled in its frame. Someone was trying to force the lock from outside. Jackson motioned for silence as footsteps circled the small building. At least 3 men moved through the darkness beyond the windows. Smoke began seeping under the door. The acrid smell of kerosene filled the cabin air. Someone had doused the exterior walls with accelerant and struck a match. Jackson kicked open the back door as flames licked at the front windows. The 3 allies grabbed Samuel's evidence and fled into the night. Dory clutched her husband's journal while Hattie carried her camera equipment and documentation. They ran toward the barn as the cabin exploded into an inferno. Orange light danced against the darkness like demons celebrating destruction. Smoke billowed across the prairie in thick black clouds. Sheriff Tremble's men had torched the building to destroy the evidence, but they had miscalculated the determination of their targets. The most damaging documentation was already safely in Allied hands. Hattie's camera clicked repeatedly as she documented the arson. Each photograph captured proof of the criminal conspiracy's escalation. The images would provide irrefutable evidence of attempted murder and destruction of property. Jackson saddled their horses, while Dory gathered emergency supplies from the barn. They could not return to town where Tremble controlled law enforcement. They needed a safe location to plan their counterattack. The abandoned Mackenzie homestead sat 5 miles north of Dusty Hollow. The family had been driven off their land 6 months earlier through fraudulent legal proceedings. Their empty house would provide temporary shelter. As they rode through the darkness, other families emerged from their homes. The cabin fire had awakened half the county. People gathered along the roadside to watch the flames consume everything Dory had left of her life with Samuel. Some faces showed sympathy for her loss. Others displayed suspicion about what might have caused such destruction. A few revealed satisfaction that the troublesome widow had finally been dealt with. But several families approached with their own stories of mysterious property disputes. They had faced similar challenges to their land ownership. They had encountered the same suspicious irregularities in official documentation. The Mackenzie house stood empty and cold in the moonlight. Dust sheets covered abandoned furniture like ghosts of former happiness. Broken windows stared out at overgrown fields where crops once flourished. Jackson lit a fire in the stone fireplace, while Hattie organized her photographs by date. Dory decoded more of Samuel's measurements, using candlelight to illuminate the cramped calculations. Each new revelation painted a clearer picture of the criminal conspiracy. Railroad companies had secretly funded the land acquisition scheme. Corrupt officials at multiple levels had participated in the fraud. The stolen properties formed a continuous corridor along the planned rail route. Sheriff Tremble was not the mastermind, but rather a local operative in a much larger criminal organization. The real leaders operated from distant cities and commanded resources that dwarfed anything their small group could muster. But they possessed something the criminals had failed to anticipate. Samuel's meticulous documentation provided mathematical proof of the conspiracy. Hattie's photographs offered visual evidence of criminal activity. Jackson's law enforcement experience guided their legal strategy. Dawn approached as they finalized their plan. The evidence would be presented publicly where Sheriff Tremble could not suppress or destroy it. The entire community would witness the truth about the systematic theft of their neighbor's property. Dory stared at the ashes of her former life glowing in the distance. Samuel's murder had been intended to silence the truth. Instead, it had created 3 determined allies committed to exposing every detail of the criminal conspiracy. Word of the cabin fire spread through Dusty Hollow like wildfire itself. By morning, half the town knew that Dory Temples had lost everything. The other half pretended not to care. Sheriff Tremble called an emergency town meeting for that very afternoon. He announced it as a public safety discussion about preventing future property disasters. His real purpose was to seize Dory's remaining land claims while she was vulnerable and homeless. The town hall filled with curious residents and concerned property owners. Farmers who had faced similar disputes sat in the back rows. Merchants who profited from the status quo occupied the front seats. Sheriff Tremble's deputies positioned themselves at every exit. Banker Theodore Whitmore sat beside the sheriff with a stack of official-looking documents. His expensive suit and gold watch marked him as the wealthiest man in 3 counties. His sympathetic smile had convinced dozens of struggling families to sign away their property rights. Whitmore had built his reputation on helping widows and minorities navigate complex legal procedures. He charged modest fees for his services and always expressed genuine concern for his clients' welfare. Everyone trusted the kindly banker who seemed to care about their problems. Dory entered the packed hall carrying Samuel's surveying equipment. Jackson followed behind her with a canvas bag full of decoded measurements. Hattie brought her camera and a portfolio of damning photographs. Sheriff Tremble began his presentation with false concern for Dory's tragic loss. He suggested that her recent difficulties proved she was unfit to manage property ownership. He recommended placing her remaining land claims under official protection until suitable arrangements could be made. The sheriff produced documents showing irregularities in Samuel's original surveys. He questioned the validity of measurements taken by a man who was clearly incompetent at his profession. He suggested that professional resurveying would benefit everyone involved. Banker Whitmore offered to handle all legal procedures at no charge to the grieving widow. His generous proposal drew approving murmurs from the audience. Several people nodded at his charitable willingness to help someone in need. Dory stood and requested permission to address the assembly. Her voice carried clearly across the crowded room as she began presenting Samuel's decoded evidence. She explained how her husband had discovered the systematic falsification of property surveys throughout the county. Jackson stepped forward and identified Sheriff Tremble's methods as identical to those used by the disbanded Crimson Creek Gang. His testimony carried the weight of federal law enforcement experience. His detailed knowledge of criminal procedures silenced the skeptical murmurs. Hattie began displaying her photographs around the room. Images of the cabin arson attempt, pictures of destroyed survey markers, documentation of midnight meetings between Tremble's deputies and unknown strangers. But the most shocking revelation came when Dory presented Samuel's calculations about the underground water system. The decoded measurements revealed that Dusty Hollow sat on top of a massive aquifer worth millions to railroad development companies. Sheriff Tremble jumped to his feet and accused the three allies of fabricating evidence. He claimed Samuel's notes were the desperate fantasies of a failed surveyor. He suggested that Dory had burned down her own cabin to gain sympathy and avoid losing her property. The audience began taking sides as evidence mounted on both fronts. Some residents believed the mathematical proof and photographic documentation. Others trusted their longtime sheriff and questioned the motives of outsiders making wild accusations. Then Banker Whitmore made his fatal mistake. He stood to defend Sheriff Tremble's character and dismissed the allegations as female hysteria combined with criminal desperation. But his defense revealed knowledge that he should not have possessed. Whitmore mentioned specific details about Samuel's final survey measurements. He referenced conversations between Samuel and Sheriff Tremble that had never been made public. He demonstrated intimate familiarity with the railroad development timeline. Jackson recognized the significance immediately. Only someone deeply involved in the conspiracy would know such precise information. Whitmore had revealed himself as a major participant rather than an innocent bystander. Dory pressed her advantage by presenting Samuel's financial calculations. The decoded numbers showed that someone with banking connections had been funneling railroad money into local land purchases. The payment patterns matched deposits into Whitmore's bank during the same time periods. Hattie produced photographs of nighttime meetings between Whitmore and out-of-town investors. Her documentation showed the banker had been coordinating the land acquisition scheme from the beginning. His helpful assistance to struggling property owners had actually been reconnaissance for future theft. The audience erupted into angry shouts as the full scope of betrayal became clear. Families who had trusted Whitmore with their legal problems realized they had been manipulated by the very man they thought was helping them. Sheriff Tremble tried to restore order, but his authority was crumbling before their eyes. Deputies looked uncertain as residents demanded explanations for the damning evidence. Several officers stepped away from their posts as public opinion shifted dramatically. Jackson presented his final piece of testimony about Samuel's murder. The surveyor had been killed because he threatened to expose the entire criminal conspiracy. His death had been staged to look accidental by professionals experienced in eliminating troublesome witnesses. Whitmore's face went pale as Jackson described the methods used by the Crimson Creek gang. The banker's hands shook as he realized his connection to the disbanded criminal organization was about to be exposed. The room fell silent as residents absorbed the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Their trusted sheriff and respected banker had been systematically stealing their neighbor's property through an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Dory stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by irrefutable evidence of justice denied and truth revealed. The town hall erupted into chaos as residents demanded answers from their corrupt officials. Sheriff Trimble backed toward the exit, while banker Whitmore clutched his fraudulent documents like a shield. Their years of criminal conspiracy had been exposed in a single devastating presentation. But Dory raised her hand for silence. Her voice cut through the angry shouts with calm authority. She requested that justice be served through proper legal channels rather than mob violence. The evidence would speak for itself in federal court. Jackson stepped forward and placed Sheriff Trimble under citizen's arrest. His former martial training gave him the knowledge to detain suspects legally. He confiscated Trimble's badge and weapon while reading the charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Banker Whitmore tried to slip out through a side door, but found his path blocked by angry residents. Families he had betrayed surrounded him with decades of pent-up frustration. His expensive suit offered no protection against their righteous indignation. Hattie documented everything with her camera. The photographs would provide evidence of the community's response to the corruption revelations. Her images captured the moment when truth triumphed over systematic oppression. 2 of Sheriff Trimble's deputies removed their badges and joined the citizens demanding justice. They had unknowingly participated in the criminal conspiracy through their loyalty to a corrupt superior. Their willingness to switch sides demonstrated the power of revealed truth. The remaining deputies found themselves vastly outnumbered by an aroused citizenry. They laid down their weapons rather than defend criminals who had betrayed their oaths of office. Even corrupt authority could not withstand the united opposition of an entire community. Federal marshals arrived within 3 days of Hattie's telegraphed report. Jackson's former colleagues took custody of all suspects and evidence. The scope of the criminal conspiracy impressed even experienced federal investigators. Sheriff Trimble and banker Whitmore faced charges in federal court, where local corruption could not influence the proceedings. Their connections to railroad investors and out-of-state criminal networks made this a matter of interstate commerce and federal jurisdiction. The trial lasted 2 weeks and drew newspaper reporters from across the region. Dory's mathematical testimony provided irrefutable proof of the fraudulent surveys. Jackson's law enforcement expertise connected local crimes to broader criminal patterns. Hattie's photographs offered visual evidence that no jury could dismiss. Both defendants received lengthy prison sentences and financial penalties that stripped them of their ill-gotten wealth. The stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners through court-ordered restitution. Justice moved slowly but moved decisively. The town council appointed Jackson as interim sheriff until proper elections could be held. His federal marshal experience and proven integrity made him the natural choice for restoring legitimate law enforcement. He accepted the position with the solemn commitment to protect rather than exploit the vulnerable. Dory used the insurance settlement from her burned cabin to establish the Samuel Temple Survey Institute. The school would train minorities and women in surveying techniques and property law. Her husband's legacy would live on through education and empowerment. The institute occupied a new building constructed on Dory's legally secured property. Students came from across the territory to learn the skills that could protect their communities from future fraud. Samuel's surveying equipment became teaching tools for the next generation. Hattie's investigative reporting earned her a position with a major regional newspaper. Her documentation of the Dusty Hollow conspiracy launched a career exposing corruption throughout the frontier territories. Truth-telling had become her life's mission and professional calling. The underground spring system brought legitimate prosperity to Dusty Hollow when the railroad arrived 2 years later. Property values increased fairly for all residents rather than being stolen by criminal conspirators. The water wealth benefited the entire community as Samuel had originally intended. Other communities requested assistance from the Samuel Temple's Survey Institute when they suspected similar fraudulent schemes. Dory traveled throughout the territory teaching property owners how to protect their land rights through mathematical precision and legal knowledge. Jackson found redemption in his new role as protector of the vulnerable. His decade of guilt finally lifted as he used his skills to prevent the kind of injustices that had haunted him since Amarillo County. Every family he helped erased another piece of his shame. The Institute's first graduation ceremony took place on a warm spring morning 3 years after the conspiracy's exposure. 12 students received certificates in surveying and property law. 6 were women. 4 were minorities who had never before had access to such technical education. Dory stood before her graduates with Samuel's original surveying compass in her hands. She spoke about the power of knowledge to overcome oppression. She reminded them that truth supported by mathematics could defeat even the most sophisticated criminal schemes. Jackson attended the ceremony in his official sheriff's uniform. The badge on his chest now represented legitimate authority rather than corrupt power. His presence symbolized the transformation that had occurred throughout their community. Hattie documented the graduation for her newspaper readers. Her article would inspire other communities to establish similar educational programs. The ripple effects of their victory continued spreading across the frontier territories. The ceremony concluded with Dory teaching a new group of students how to read survey markers. Jackson helped a young widow understand her property rights. Their partnership had evolved from desperate alliance to permanent collaboration in the service of justice. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.